The early 18th century stood at a crossroads in history. The old world of absolute monarchs and the all-powerful church was fading, and a new world, driven by reason, science and trade, was beginning to take shape. It was the first truly modern age when people across Western Europe started to believe that progress was possible and that human reason could reshape society itself. Hi everyone, welcome back to the Litcenter channel. This is part 5 in our series on English literature, and in this episode we are looking at literature in the 18th century, a period often called the Age of Reason. We will explore how writers like Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope used satire to question society, how the first great English novels like Robinson Crusoe emerged, and how the Industrial Revolution at the end of the century paved the way towards Romanticism. Since literature is always a product of the people and cultural context in which it is created, we will also cover the most important historical events in the 18th century. When the 18th century began, England had finally achieved a kind of balance after generations of turmoil. The violence and uncertainties of the Civil War were long gone, and the fierce religious divisions of the 1600s had slowly given way to a more stable and pragmatic society. The country was no longer ruled by absolute monarchs, but by a constitutional system in which the king governed alongside Parliament. This settlement, established after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, gave England a political foundation strong enough to last for centuries. Under this new system, the king could no longer rule by divine right alone. Real power now rested on laws, property, and the ability to persuade others. Politics became a matter of discussion and compromise. Decisions were debated in Parliament, where the two main political parties, the Whigs and the Tories, argued over how the country should be governed. Outside Parliament, people followed these debates in newspapers and pamphlets, and discussed them in coffee houses and clubs. For the first time, ordinary citizens, at least those who could read and vote, began to have a voice in public affairs. London became the heart of this new society. It was the biggest and most dynamic city in Europe, a place where money, ideas, and people constantly crossed paths. Trade from all across the world passed through its docks, while its workshops and banks powered the growing economy. Printing presses produced newspapers, essays, and political pamphlets by the thousands, feeding a public hungry for information and debate. In this lively world of commerce and conversation, writers found both a subject and an audience, a new public eager to read, argue, and think for itself. Literature was no longer confined to the court or the church, it belonged to the reading public. This confidence in human understanding was part of a larger movement known as the Enlightenment. That is why this period is often referred to as the Age of Reason. Thinkers of the time believed that the world could be studied and improved through observation, logic, and education. John Locke, in the previous century, had argued that the mind begins as a blank state, a so-called tabula rasa, and that knowledge is shaped by experience rather than divine inspiration. Isaac Newton had shown that nature followed discoverable laws, and later philosophers such as David Hume and Adam Smith applied the same spirit of inquiry to questions of morality, economics, and human behavior. At the same time, Britain continued to expand its reach overseas. Trade and empire brought wealth, but also moral tension. The sugar and tobacco that enriched English merchants were produced by enslaved labor in distant colonies. This contradiction between prosperity and injustice, enlightenment and exploitation, would become one of the great moral questions of the century. As Britain grew in power and confidence, the early decades of the 18th century came to be known as the Augustan Age, a name deliberately borrowed from ancient Rome. During the reign of Emperor Augustus, Roman culture had reached a golden age of order, balance, and refinement. British authors saw themselves in a similar position, living after a time of upheaval and now restoring stability through art, reason, and taste. Instead of the passionate introspection of the earlier poetry, Augustan writers turned outward, towards society. They wrote about human folly, vanity, and ambition, using wit and irony as tools of moral criticism. One of the central figures of the Augustan age was Alexander Pope. His poetry, written mostly in rhymed couplets, combined sharp observation with technical precision. In An Essay on Criticism, published in 1711, Pope explained how judgment and taste are shaped by reason and learning. In The Rape of the Lock, published in 1712, he used humor to transform a small social incident, a stolen lock of hair, into a mock epic that playfully exposed the vanity of polite society. Pope's poems show how the Augustans used wit and form to reflect on human behavior, not simply to display cleverness. Another defining feature of this time was the rise of prose and the novel. As literacy spread and printing became cheaper, readers wanted stories about familiar people and real experiences that they could relate to. Writers began to explore individual character and moral choice. Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, published in 1719, tells a story of a man shipwrecked on a deserted island and forced to survive alone for nearly 30 years. On the surface, it's an adventure story, full of danger, hard work, and the struggle to stay alive. But beneath that, it's also a moral and spiritual journey. Crusoe learns to build a new world from nothing, discovering self-reliance, discipline through his own experience rather than through authority or doctrine. Defoe's novel reflects the values of his age: reason, hard work, and the belief that moral strength can overcome adversity. Yet it also reveals the contradictions of the expanding British world. Crusoe trades slaves, claims land, and rules over his companion Friday. Written in a plain, factual style that made it feel real, Robinson Crusoe transformed prose fiction into a new kind of art, one that combines realism, moral reflection, and psychological depth. It set a pattern for the English novel that would dominate the rest of the century. At the same time, many writers used satire to examine the moral and political questions of their age. The most powerful of them was Jonathan Swift, a man of wit, intellect, and morality. Swift was both a clergyman and a political writer, and his works reveal deep unease about the corruption and hypocrisy of his age. His most famous book, Gulliver's Travels, published in 1726, is often read as an adventure story, but it is in fact a fierce satire on human nature and society. Through the travels of Lemuel Gulliver to fantasy lands like Lilliput and Brobdingnag, Swift exposes the absurdity of politics, science, and human pride. The tiny people of Lilliput, for example, fight deadly wars over ludicrous things, like for example which end of an egg should be broken, a biting parody of real-world religious and political disputes. Swift's tone is ironic, his humor is sharp, but his purpose is very serious, to hold up a mirror to the people of his age and show them how far they have strayed from reason and morality. Swift also wrote an influential satirical essay called A Modest Proposal, published in 1729. In the essay, he suggested, with chilling irony, that the poverty in Ireland could be solved if the poor sold their children as food to the rich. Of course, he did not mean this literally. Swift used shock to expose the cruelty and indifference of British policy toward the Irish poor. This essay is a masterpiece of irony. Its calm, logical tone only heightens the horror of its argument, forcing readers to confront the moral blindness of their society. Samuel Richardson took the new form of the novel in a very different direction. Where Defoe focused on adventure and survival, Richardson turned inward, exploring emotion, virtue, and moral choice. His novels were written entirely in letters, a style known as the epistolary form, which allowed readers to experience events through the private thoughts of the characters themselves. His first major work, Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded, published in 1740, tells a story of a young servant girl whose employer tries to seduce her. Through Pamela's letters and journal entries, we watch her resist temptation, defend her dignity, and ultimately win respect and marriage. The novel became a sensation. Middle-class readers saw in Pamela a model of personal virtue, a woman who triumphs not through wealth or birth, but through honesty, faith, and self-control. Pamela became one of the earliest and most influential examples of the sentimental novel. This form of novel focuses on moral feeling, sympathy, and personal virtue. Richardson wanted his readers to reflect on questions of conscience and behavior, not just following the plot. Other important novelists include Henry Fielding, whose comic masterpiece Tom Jones, published in 1749, combined adventure, social observation and humor to portray a wide-ranging picture of English society. Tobias Smollett wrote picaresque novels like Roderick Random, published in 1748, and Peregrine Pickle, full of satire, episodic adventures and vividly drawn characters. Lawrence Sterne later in the century experimented with form and psychology in Tristram Shandy, blending digression, humor and reflection on the nature of storytelling itself. Together, these writers helped establish the English novel as a flexible, expressive form capable of exploring morality, society and the human mind. By the middle and later decades of the 18th century, English literature began to shift. While the early century had celebrated reason, order and social satire, a new sensibility emerged, one more concerned with emotion, reflection and the individual's place in the world. This change is often associated with Thomas Gray and the group sometimes called the Graveyard Poets. Thomas Gray is best known for his elegy written in a country churchyard, a poem that combines careful observation, moral reflection and profound emotional depth. Unlike the sharp wit of Pope, Gray's work dwells on memory, mortality and the passage of time. The elegy meditates on the lives of ordinary villages whose quiet existence and uncelebrated deaths are given dignity through Gray's language. The poem's melancholic tone and reflective style made it enormously influential, signaling a move away from the strict formality and social focus of Augustan poetry. Gray and the Graveyard Poets, including Edward Young and Thomas Parnell, were part of a broader interest in mortality, the sublime and the natural world. They wrote meditative poetry often set in churchyards, ruins or desolate landscapes. Their work explored human mortality, the fleeting nature of life and the emotional experience of grief and contemplation. While still formal and measured in style, these poets paved the way for a more personal, introspective literature, a clear bridge from Enlightenment reason to romantic feeling. One major factor was a social and economic change brought by industrialization. Cities like London and Manchester expanded rapidly, crowded with factories, merchants and workers. Life became noisier, faster and more impersonal. Many writers and readers felt the pressures of urban life and longed for spaces of calm, reflection and natural beauty. This desire for escape from the city and the demands of modern life became a central theme in the literature that would evolve into Romanticism. Foreign influences also played a role. German writers, especially Goethe and the Sturm und Drang movement, celebrated emotional intensity, individual freedom and the power of nature. These ideas appealed to the growing urban audiences in Britain who, caught up in the noise and pace of city life, felt increasingly alienated from the simple beauty of the countryside. At the same time, interest in distant or ancient worlds grew. James Macpherson's Ossian poems, published in the 1760s, portrayed heroic, melancholic figures in wild landscapes. Macpherson presented them as the work of an ancient Scottish bard, and they were often compared to Homer for their sweeping tales of heroism and tragic beauty. Like Homer, Ossian's world was vast and dramatic, full of lonely heroes and grand landscapes, and a sense of fate and melancholy that stirred deep emotion in readers. If you are interested in the mythical Celtic poet Ossian, I have an entire video devoted to him. You can watch it on the channel. This combination of urban pressures, overseas and foreign influence, and a fascination with emotional depth and wild landscapes set the stage for Romanticism. By the end of the 18th century, writers were increasingly turning inward, exploring the imagination, memory, and nature as a refuge from industrialized, rationalized life. The Romantic movement would fully embrace these concerns, placing emotion, individuality, and the natural world at the heart of English literature. Ultimately, the 18th century literature in England is a story of balance and transition. The early century gave us satire, mock epics, and the rise of the novel, while the later decades introduced reflection, sentiment, and the first stirrings of romantic sensibility. From Swift's sharp irony to Richardson's emotional novels, and from Defoe's realistic adventures to Gray's elegiac meditations, the century explored reason, morality, and human experience in all its forms. In the next episode, we will move into the Romantic era, exploring how writers embraced emotion, imagination, and the natural world to create some of the most enduring works in English literature. See you next time.